We Shall Overcome is an anthem of hope. It's aspirational even when there is no hope. Thinking back to those dark days of flagrant and open racial oppression in the United States, I can imagine that certain achievements would have seemed inconceivable. For instance, as the embers of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre still smoldered, I cannot imagine anyone would have looked into the distant future, the wisps of time somewhere over the horizon, and had the ability to imagine that we would ever have a black U.S. president. Yet it happened. There is a reason for hope. Still, for all of the strides forward, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 65, and so many others, we still have a lot of work to do. Everyone doesn't experience the same equality, even though God did create everyone equal. In Romans 6:23, Paul points out the obvious, that everyone has sinned and fallen short of God's perfection. But that's true every single day with every one of us. We're all sinners in need of grace. And as long as people choose their own way over God's way, there will be a need to overcome oppression and inequality. Every February, we celebrate racial diversity during Black History Month. We remember the incredible accomplishments, sometimes in the face of seemingly overwhelming obstacles, of people of color. We also note the need for continuing work in overcoming inequality. But right now, when I think of overcoming oppression, my mind goes a little bit to where Will mentioned in the invocation, or Val went in the morning prayer. My mind goes to Ukraine and the Russian invasion. Overcoming oppression and inequality requires change in any context. It requires an inner transformation, whether that's spiritual change or not. Fixing broken systems means people change the way they see the world. For people of faith, that means turning to the divine. In our gospel lesson in Luke chapter 9, Jesus, along with Peter, John, and James, did just that. They went up a mountain to pray and to reflect. Getting away from everything is good, and it can create space to find some clarity, to clear one's head, to get away from the distractions of daily life, to leave the grind for a moment and try to listen to God. When they reached the mountaintop, something unexpected happens. And we don't need me to fill in the gaps, because we heard this beautifully and eloquently told in our children's sermon. Jesus changed right before their eyes. And then Moses, the great lawgiver, and Elijah, the great prophet, appeared with him. Their presence and respective roles add to this story. But today I want to focus on change and the impact that has on the world. In that moment of Jesus' transfiguration, Peter reached out, grasping at straws, looking for something that was familiar. He offered to build 3 little places for them to live, dwellings for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. This might sound like a strange reaction to us, but his offer referenced Sukkot, or the Jewish Feast of Booths. He was just trying to put what he saw happening into a context that made sense to him. While the disciples were still trying to wrap their minds around what they could see, a voice from a cloud affirmed Jesus' identity. "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." Now, this experience would seem like the kind of thing that would change someone forever. And I appreciated Will's opening words to hearken our minds to those experiences we've had, maybe with a conversation or a view or an experience where we saw things a little differently. Except that the gospel is quite realistic, because just after this episode, the disciples, just a few verses later, started arguing about which one was the greatest. These are the same guys who were just with Jesus on the mountaintop. And now, barely having gotten over huffing and puffing up the mountain and back down, they had the audacity to argue about which one was the greatest. We don't need Paul's reminder that everyone sinned. We find creative ways to sin even when we're in the presence of Christ. It's no wonder the world is so messy. We shouldn't be confused that people find innovative ways to hate and exclude. Whether it's based on someone's skin color or sexual orientation, or simply because they live in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine reflects the lengths to which humanity will go to avoid living in harmony. Still, we don't have to travel around the world or go back through the mists of time to find people excluding, ignoring, or hating others. We do it too. Since most of us can't directly stand up to the Russian oppression in Ukraine, we can take a look at our own lives and see how we can live to reflect that holy calling from Christ to love your neighbor as yourself. When we go with Jesus up the mountain, we can experience who Jesus is, but we don't get to stay on the mountain. We come down and we proclaim a kind of divine kingdom that encompasses every part of life. We step away from everything that keeps us from living in full communion with God and others. This transformation, this transfiguration in us involves painful and unavoidable aspects of introspection and living, like dealing with our own racism, ageism, ableism, sexism, homophobia, intolerance, our biases, our isolationism. Ukraine's a long way away. Our political polarization. Did I miss anyone? The experience of transfiguration isn't about staying on the mountaintop. Before our gospel lesson, a few verses before our reading began, right at the beginning of Luke 9, Peter acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah. Did he really have to go all the way to the top of the mountain to be able to see the transfiguration, to know who Jesus was? But Jesus, in that exchange, corrected Peter's acknowledgement, saying, you don't get what being the Messiah is all about. You realize that I'm going to suffer, be rejected, die, and then overcome death through resurrection. Our reading, the Transfiguration, comes along not as a confirmation of Jesus' prediction, but to emphasize his power over death. It's about who Jesus is. Peter, in that moment, just like in any beautiful moment, wanted to stay there. Let's build houses. Let's live in this moment. We'd all be like that, wouldn't we? Once we get there, we want to stay. Yet if we follow Jesus, we have to keep following him down the mountain, back to life. He says, it's time to go. It's time to come down from the mountain and get back to work. Friends, we've got a lot of work to do here in Charlottesville. There's still too much racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, and intolerance, and the list could go on. Jesus meant it when he said, love your neighbor as yourself, so we have got a lot of work to do. There are lots of examples of how to go about that work. We could look around and see stories, inspirational ones. But I'd like to go back a little bit, inspired by our anthem this morning, to April 3rd, 1968, When the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I've been to the Mountaintop" speech, he spoke to striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And in that speech, he said, the issue is injustice. The issue is the refusal of Memphis to be fair and honest in its dealings with its public servants, who happen to be sanitation workers. For us, it doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter what you brought with you this morning. It doesn't matter who we are. It matters who God calls us to be. It matters who God calls us to help. Love your neighbor as yourself takes many forms. We can stand against hatred and exclusion, or we can stand with people who experience injustice, like King did with the sanitation workers. We can stand for peace in Ukraine, fair wages for everyone, regardless of their gender or what they look like. We can stand for inclusion and protection and full participation for everyone. The part that I find most inspiring of King's speech that night was the conclusion. I'd like to share that with you now. He said, well, I don't know what will happen. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything, and I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. King didn't stay on that mountaintop. He came down and returned to his work for racial equality, and he was assassinated the very next day. We can go to the mountain with Jesus and experience something amazing. But just like the disciples, Peter, John, and James, we don't get to stay there. We come down to the world and join the holy work of living out Jesus' calling. Whether we seek to overcome oppression and inequality in our own city, or stand with Ukraine, or join some other movement for peace and equality, with God's help and with God's guidance, we shall overcome someday. Amen.